Welcome to part 5 of the Industrial Revolution. Now we're going to take a look at a new class society. Now, one of the changes that happened during the Industrial Revolution is that there was some shifting around in the upper and the middle class, right? Some of the wealthiest and smartest aristocrats exploited the mineral wealth of their landed holdings, forest or mining or whatever, and invested in factories and railways and steamships and jumped right on board this industrial revolution. Those aristocratic families who were already wealthy grew wealthier. Others, though, did not, right? In the long term, the aristocracy was infiltrated with a challenging, new, more powerful middle class. Old middling orders, the old productive middling orders of the 19th century, are going to benefit greatly from this industrial revolution, right? The great merchants and the professionals, the money lenders and stuff, they're going to be the ones behind the new factories, and the advancements, right? And so they're going to become extremely wealthy, fabulously so, in fact, and will find themselves pushing their way into the aristocracy, right? You're going to end up with some very fabulous, wealthy families like the Wedgwood China dynasty in England, right? Or Vickers Arms Manufacturing, or Cadbury Chocolate, right? Or Rothschild Banking in France, Krupp Armaments in Germany, the Astar Land Banking in Germany as well, the Vanderbilts and the railroads, right, in the United States, along with J.P. Morgan in banking. These people are going to become part of the ruling elite, if you will, or at least the aristocratic elite, right? Throughout Western Europe, this new wealthy middle class are going to begin to more and more demand more political power. So you're now going to have, talking about some cascading, some pressure on the social realm as well. On the flip side of this, there was those that weren't as successful, like for some of these smaller shopkeepers and these smaller craftsmen. I mean, if you're a craftsman, you can't compete with these large, cheap, mass-produced goods being created in factories. And the need for craftsmen began to drop, right? Cobblers, tailors, ironworkers begin to fall out of the middle class and fall into a lower class. Apprenticeships start going away because you don't need skilled workers anymore. You just need unskilled factory workers, right? And these factory workers often worked at starvation wages, right? So now you have the development of what's called the working class, right? The working class and these urban factory workers are entirely a creation of the Industrial Revolution. Now, as on the farm, all members of a family in the working class would begin working as soon as they were old enough to do so. They could begin working as early as age 6. Right? The wages were often poor because there was such a huge labor market. You don't like your wages? Well, that's fine. We'll just find somebody else to replace you with, right? Work was strictly regimented. It was repetitive. It was often quota-based. An average worker during the Industrial Revolution worked 12 to 16 hours a day, both winter and summer, 6 days a week, 7 days a week if they were behind on quota. Working conditions were often dark. They were often noisy. They were often dangerous, right? Because the British government had a laissez-faire economic policy. There's no regulation. There's nobody to tell factory workers how to treat their workers, right? Matter of fact, ultimately, it will start to lead to a little bit of backlash, right? In the early 19th century, some members of the British Parliament began to question this. What is the condition like for workers? And in fact, in 1832, they'll take a study called the Sadler Commission into Child Labor, right? And the factory workers themselves were called in the House of Commons to report on the conditions inside of British factories. The Sadler Commission's findings are actually published in the Parliamentary Papers of 1831, 1832, Volume 15. If anybody's ever interested in reading some of the testimonials given by these factory workers. Now, the living conditions in these industrial towns weren't very good either. I mean, these towns grew so fast that it was impossible to plan for the arrival of these thousands of migrant workers, right? They threw up tenements. These are basically row houses, these tenement houses, right? They didn't have any indoor plumbing. They didn't have toilets. A lot of them didn't even have windows. And the air itself in the towns was thick with factory smoke and the smell of tanneries and dye works, not to mention human and animal excrement and smells from the river as well, right? Every place was terribly overcrowded. You had entire families, and sometimes the extended families, living in a single room. Right? The working class diet was not very substantial. It typically consisted of potatoes, weak stews, and then stimulants like tea, and then depressants like alcohol. So it's not too surprising that the people in these industrial cities were prone to all kinds of different diseases, and that you would have disease outbreaks in these industrial cities: typhus, cholera, diphtheria, malaria, smallpox, right? In 1840, the average death rate in Great Britain was 1 in every 45 per year. But in Manchester, in the industrial town of Manchester, it was 1 in 20, right? A lot of people worried about the implications of the lifestyle, especially on the spiritual well-being of these people. In Britain, for example, the government sponsored a poor law, but it was supposed to be administered by the local parishes. Well, in a lot of these industrialized towns, there was no parish in which to administer them, right? The industrial economy was also very fluid. You would have booms and busts. You would have these shifting tides, which would cause populations to shift around from industrial town to industrial town, right? Living conditions were such that privacy was pretty much impossible, right? So not only did that promote disease, but also promoted abuse, domestic violence, and sexual promiscuity. Matter of fact, it's estimated between 1830 and 1850 in Britain, as much as 1/2 of all the babies born were illegitimate. So ultimately, we need to ask the question, qui bono, right? Who benefits from this industrial revolution? Now, an optimist will point out that you have this general increase of national wealth, you have Britain's domination of world industry, trade, finance, productivity, the rise in per capita income, things like that. While the pessimist would point out things like the misery of the working class, job insecurity, the boom and bust cycles, and the poor working and living conditions in these industrialized cities. Ultimately, it's the people that will have to respond to this. And they're going to be broken down. The responses can be broken down into 3 categories. We're going to have the liberal response, the romantic response, and the socialist response.